It was 1961, and Harlem felt alive with unrest. The civil rights movement was gathering strength, the streets were charged with protests, and the demand for change echoed through the heart of America. Bumpy Johnson, the man who had ruled Harlem's underworld for decades, knew that power came in many forms. He had survived years of violence, betrayal, and shifting alliances. But today, in the sweltering summer heat, he was about to face a different kind of challenge. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the face of the movement for racial equality, had come to Harlem, a man of peace, a man of principle, standing on the precipice of greatness. But Bumpy was no stranger to the power struggles of Harlem, and he wasn't sure where a man like King fit into his world. The two men were about to meet face to face in a small church on the edge of the neighborhood. Outside, the world was changing, but inside, a quiet storm was brewing. Bumpy wasn't sure what King wanted, but he knew one thing. The streets didn't bend to ideals. The streets bent to those who knew how to make people listen. And Bumpy had made people listen for years. As Bumpy entered the church, the air felt thick with anticipation. King was standing in front of a small group of activists. His calm presence a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that swirled outside. The moment Bumpy stepped through the door, there was a brief silence. People knew who he was, even in a place like this. His reputation had preceded him. Doctor. King turned to face him, and for a moment there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Two giants of their own worlds were about to come together, and no one was sure what would happen next. Mr. Johnson, King said, his voice steady but firm. I'm glad you agreed to meet with me. Bumpy didn't flinch. He looked King up and down, his eyes assessing, calculating. I'm sure you didn't come here to waste my time, Doc, he said, his voice cool, but with an undercurrent of challenge. It wasn't just a meeting of minds, it was a meeting of worlds, and Bumpy wasn't convinced that King's world could survive in his own. Bumpy Johnson wasn't born a king, but he made himself one. He had risen from the grim poverty of Charleston, South Carolina in the early 1900s, learning early on that the only way to survive was to take power with both hands. Harlem had become his empire, and Bumpy ruled it like a sovereign, an underworld king who controlled everything from the streets to the politicians. But it wasn't just about violence or intimidation. Bumpy had a code, a respect for the people who worked under him, for the streets that had shaped him. His name wasn't just feared, it was respected. From bootleggers to politicians, from drug dealers to the everyday folks who lived in the heart of Harlem, Bumpy had earned a place in their lives. He understood the pulse of the streets, and he knew that power came with a price. Harlem in the 1960s was a place on the edge. Black Americans were demanding their rights, and the civil rights movement was in full swing. But while King and others were marching for equality, Bumpy was focused on survival. The political landscape was changing, but for someone like Bumpy, the streets remained the same. Brutal, unforgiving, and governed by a different set of rules. In contrast, Martin Luther King Jr. was a man of ideals, a man who spoke of nonviolence, equality, and justice. He had a dream, and the world was listening. His peaceful approach was revolutionary, but in the eyes of men like Bumpy Johnson, who had been through the streets of Harlem and seen the worst of what the world had to offer, King's vision seemed almost naive. King's message had inspired millions, but Bumpy had seen too much to be swayed by speeches alone. He had seen what happened when men like him put their faith in power structures that didn't care for the people. For Bumpy, power was something you fought for, something you earned with every step you took, with every deal you made. King and Johnson were like two sides of a coin. One preached peace, while the other understood the necessity of force. Both men had an iron grip on their worlds, but one had to ask, which world would bend first? The tension in the room was palpable. King, with his calm demeanor and unwavering belief in peace, stood tall, his eyes steady, as he spoke about justice, equality, and the nonviolent path forward. But Bumpy was no preacher. He wasn't here to listen to lectures on morality or ideals. He was a man of action, a man who understood what it took to survive in a world where every move could cost you everything. "You speak of peace, Dr. King," Bumpy said, his voice cutting through the air. "But the streets don't have room for peace. The streets are about survival. They're about power. And if you can't fight for what you want, then you'll lose everything." King looked him in the eye, his voice unwavering. "Mr. Johnson, I understand that life on the streets is hard, but violence only begets more violence. If we want to see real change, we must rise above that." Bumpy's expression hardened. He had heard it all before. The speeches, the ideals, the calls for unity. But none of it had ever been enough to change the system. Harlem had seen leaders come and go, but Bumpy had stayed because he understood what it took to survive. And he knew that, in the world he lived in, there was only one way to gain respect: power. "I don't need your lessons on peace," Bumpy shot back. "I've seen what happens when people don't fight back. They get stepped on. And I'm not about to let anyone walk over me or my people." King stood his ground, his calm demeanor never wavering. "And I'm not about to let our people become prisoners of hate and violence. We have to fight for change. But we do it with dignity and respect. We do it with our hearts, not our fists." The room was quiet. The activists watching knew this wasn't just a meeting. It was a moment of reckoning. Two men, each with a vision for the future, clashing in the heart of Harlem. But it wasn't just about them. It was about the future of the community, the future of the streets, and what kind of world they would leave behind. The tension hung in the air like smoke, thick and unyielding. Bumpy leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes never leaving King's calm, unwavering gaze. This was the part Bumpy hated, the part where words and ideals didn't matter. He had seen it before, time and time again. Men like King, full of conviction but too naive to understand the harsh truths of survival. King had come into his world, but he hadn't yet understood it. "You talk about dignity," Bumpy said slowly, his voice low, almost mocking. "But where was your dignity when they hung our people from trees? Where was your dignity when they treated us like animals in the streets? You can't preach peace when the world spits on you every day. The only dignity I know is the one I take with my own hands. If you want respect, you have to take it." King didn't flinch. His voice was still calm, even though the air crackled with the friction between them. "Mr. Johnson, I don't deny the struggles we face. I don't deny the violence we've endured. But that's precisely why we must rise above it. We can't let ourselves become what we despise. Violence only begets more violence. We must show the world that we're better than that." Bumpy's jaw tightened. He had heard it all before, but the words never hit him the way they hit others. Maybe it was because he had seen the other side of the coin, the reality that when you're pushed to the edge, there's nothing left but to fight back. He had built his empire on that truth. There was no room for ideals in his world, only cold, hard reality. "You talk about rising above it," Bumpy said, his voice low and full of quiet intensity. "But that ain't the world I know. The world I know doesn't give a damn about how many marches you lead or how many speeches you give. It'll crush you without a second thought. You think you can change the system from the outside? I've been inside the system, Doc. I've seen how it works. It ain't about speeches. It's about power." King's gaze softened slightly, but there was no retreat in his stance. "It's not about changing the system alone, Mr. Johnson. It's about changing ourselves. If we can change the way we fight, if we can show the world a better way, then maybe we can start changing the system from the inside. But we can't fight fire with fire. We have to fight it with something stronger. Our love for each other, our unity." Bumpy chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "Love?" he repeated. "You think love is going to stop the police from cracking your skull open in the streets? You think love is going to stop the system from breaking you down? It's a nice idea, Doc. Hell, it sounds good. But it don't work in the real world. You need power to make them listen, and I've got more of that than you can imagine. The room was still now. The group of activists, the few who had gathered to witness this meeting, were watching in stunned silence. They could see the clash of ideologies unfolding in front of them. Two giants of their own worlds locked in a battle of wills. One man with a dream of peace and nonviolence. The other, a king of the streets who had survived through sheer force. King's voice was steady, but his words carried weight. Mr. Johnson, I don't expect you to agree with me. I don't expect you to change your entire worldview in one conversation. But what I do hope is that you'll understand. No matter how much power you have, it doesn't matter unless it's used for something greater. Power without purpose is nothing but destruction. The change we need won't come through violence. It will come through unity, through strength in numbers. And if we stand together, no one can break us. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. There was a moment of silence between them, a heavy pause as the two men sized each other up. King had spoken from his heart, but Bumpy wasn't moved. It wasn't that he didn't respect King. He did. But he knew that respect alone wouldn't change the game. It was just a different world, a world where the stakes were too high to leave anything to chance. I respect what you're doing, Bumpy said finally, his voice softer, though still laced with the same undeniable authority. But respect ain't enough to keep us alive. It's the streets that decide who survives and who doesn't. And right now, it feels like you're trying to teach people how to play a game you've never even seen. King took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Bumpy's. I've seen the streets, Mr. Johnson. I know the violence, the bloodshed, the heartbreak. But I also know that the people who change the world are the ones who show others a better way. We can't keep fighting fire with fire. The fire we need is the fire of hope, of brotherhood, of justice. If we lead with that, we can change everything. Bumpy paused, the weight of King's words sinking in. For a brief moment, it felt like the room had frozen. The two men were worlds apart, yet in that moment, something shifted between them. It was clear that neither was going to convince the other, but the mutual respect was undeniable. They were both fighting for something greater than themselves. And as the room slowly began to breathe again, Bumpy Johnson's reputation as a king of the streets remained unshaken. But in that brief exchange with Martin Luther King Jr., something had changed. Perhaps, just perhaps, the streets weren't the only way to fight. As the meeting concluded, Bumpy left the church quietly, his mind racing. The streets hadn't changed, and neither had he. But something about King's words had lodged itself in his thoughts, like a seed that had yet to sprout. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew that King wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. The battle between their worlds would continue, but the respect between them was now firmly in place. For Martin Luther King Jr., the meeting was one small victory. He hadn't converted Bumpy, but he had planted a seed in the heart of one of Harlem's most feared men. And in the long run, that was enough. The aftermath of that meeting in 1961 was felt in both worlds, Harlem and the greater fight for civil rights. For Bumpy Johnson, life on the streets continued. The drug deals, the power struggles, and the quiet undercurrents of violence never stopped. He still ruled Harlem with an iron grip, unchallenged in his domain. But in the days that followed, there was a shift, a subtle change in the way he viewed the world around him. It wasn't drastic, but the conversation with King had planted a seed that would grow slowly over time. In Harlem, the meeting between the notorious Bumpy Johnson and the peaceful Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. became a talking point, a moment of confrontation between two worlds. For some, it was the embodiment of the struggle between power and principle. For others, it was a reminder that even men like Bumpy, hardened by years of survival, couldn't escape the winds of change sweeping through the country. But Bumpy's legend wasn't just built on the streets. it was also built on respect. And in Harlem, respect came in many forms. While he didn't embrace King's vision of nonviolence, he respected the man for his courage, his conviction. And that, in itself, was a rare thing for Bumpy to give. For Martin Luther King Jr., the meeting with Bumpy Johnson was just one small part of a much larger movement, but it was significant nonetheless. It wasn't about converting Bumpy to his cause, it was about showing him that there were different ways to fight. King understood the streets better than most gave him credit for. He knew the violence, the suffering, but he also knew the power of unity and peace. In the months and years that followed, King's message continued to spread, and so did Bumpy's reign over Harlem. But what most didn't see was that the two men, so different in their approaches, had, in that brief meeting, come to understand each other's worlds in a way few others could. As the civil rights movement grew, so too did the power of Bumpy Johnson. He would never be the kind of man who marched in the streets or gave speeches to crowds, but in his own way, he fought for the survival of his people, even if that fight wasn't always pretty. For Bumpy, the fight wasn't about idealism. It was about survival, about ensuring that the people who had always been left behind would have a place in the world. His empire in Harlem wasn't just a product of crime. It was a product of survival in a world that had never offered much to black men. And in the years to come, as King's movement reached its peak, the streets of Harlem would continue to echo with Bumpy's name. But they would also remember the day he had met with the man who dreamed of a better world, the man who believed that love, not power, was the answer to their struggles. The meeting between Bumpy Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1961 was a quiet collision of worlds. Two men, one a street king, the other a prophet of peace, each with their own vision of justice, survival, and respect. But what transpired that day was more than just a clash of ideologies. It was a reminder that the fight for justice comes in many forms, and that sometimes even the most hardened men can learn from those who dare to dream of a better world. For Bumpy, the meeting didn't change everything. It didn't alter the course of his life, nor did it convert him to a life of peaceful protest. But it did show him something important, that power and respect weren't just about who could make the most noise or throw the hardest punch. It was also about standing up for something greater, even if that meant taking a different path than the one you had always walked. For Martin Luther King Jr., the meeting was a small victory, a step toward understanding the complexities of the streets he fought for. It wasn't about converting Bumpy to his cause, it was about planting a seed in his heart, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of society, there could be room for hope. In the end, the legacy of that meeting wasn't one of agreement, but of mutual respect. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem's underworld, and Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of a movement for justice, had each found something in the other that couldn't be ignored. The fight for change would continue in different ways, in different places, but the respect between them remained, a reminder that even the most unlikely encounters can leave an indelible mark on history. And as Bumpy walked the streets of Harlem, continuing his reign, he carried with him a small but significant shift, a shift that reminded him, even if only in fleeting moments, that the streets of Harlem were changing, and perhaps, just maybe, it was time for him to think about the kind of legacy he would leave behind. This wasn't just about power, it was about survival. And sometimes the most powerful change begins with the smallest of moments. The meeting between Bumpy Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1961 was not a tale of conversion or triumph, but a powerful reflection of the complex, often contradictory forces shaping America during a time of upheaval. It was a moment where two worlds collided, one forged in the harsh realities of Harlem's streets, the other driven by a dream of justice and peace for all. But what made this encounter legendary wasn't the clash of ideologies, nor the sharp contrast between Bumpy's world of power and King's world of peace. It was the respect that was earned, not through agreement but through understanding. Bumpy Johnson, the feared street king, and Martin Luther King Jr., the revered leader of a nonviolent movement, stood in a room together and, for all their differences, recognized that their struggles were connected by a common thread: the fight for dignity. For Bumpy, the streets were everything. They were brutal, unforgiving, and driven by a different set of rules. But in that moment with King, he saw that there was more to the fight than just surviving. It wasn't just about power, not just about the empire he had built. It was also about leaving a legacy that meant something. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to blend both worlds: strength and respect, survival and hope. For King, the streets were a battleground too. But his fight was for something greater: a world where people could rise above their circumstances, not be defined by them. He didn't walk away from that meeting thinking he had won Bumpy over, but he understood that in a world where survival often came at a high price, his message had to find a way to speak to everyone, no matter where they came from. Both men understood power in their own way, but it wasn't just about taking control. It was about creating a lasting impact. And in the end, the story of Bumpy Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't just about two men who stood on opposite sides of a war. It was about two leaders, in their own ways, carving paths forward in a world that demanded change. In the fight for justice, there is no one way to achieve victory. There is no single path. But sometimes, it takes a legend to remind us that even the most unlikely of alliances, born from respect, not agreement, can lay the foundation for something more. Bumpy Johnson and Martin Luther King Jr. may have come from different worlds, but in that moment, they shared something far greater than a common cause. They shared a recognition that the fight for what's right, for justice, was a battle that could only be fought through the strength of their convictions. And that's what made them both legends. This wasn't just about one man's pride. It was about the dignity of a community, a legacy of resilience, and the strength to fight for a better world, no matter how different the paths may be. Sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world of what real power looks like. A power grounded in respect, built through struggle, and forged in the most unlikely of encounters.